Today we're talking about three themes that are pretty consistently present in literature for children. I've chosen to cover them during Poetry Week not because they are necessarily intimately linked with poems or with novels in verse, but because the two particular novels you could choose from this week encapsulate all three themes very clearly. If we think back to Coraline, One Crazy Summer, or George, you'll find them there too, to lesser or greater degrees, and you'll continue to find them in the rest of the literature we see in this course. Those themes are trauma, hope, and home. So the first theme is trauma. We're going to look at a definition of trauma, the role of trauma in children's literature, and the way that trauma has to do with constructions of childhood. So for our definition of trauma, I've written experiences of human suffering that cause avoidance reactions when they are internalized. As a result, they are often repressed or held in silence. That silence and repression piece is essential here. Some traumas are so horrific that even their memories can trigger intense emotional and physical reactions. Other traumas are repressed not only because of the human inclination to avoid pain, but because of the human desire for belonging. We do see some examples of truly horrifying trauma in children's literature, as in historical fiction about the Holocaust or slavery, but more frequently we see traumas that relate to constructions of aging and maturity. Essentially, we can break it down into two types of trauma. There are violence and horror, really graphic and terrifying human rights abuses. They're usually connected to historical events when they appear in children's literature. So that might include the Holocaust, bombings during the early years of the civil rights movement, murders, assaults, physical abuse, and intense humiliation as in slavery. These tend to show up in historical fiction a lot. The other type is melancholia and maturation, and that's not my term. That's based on a book of the same title by Eric Tribunella. We might describe that as a loss or experience of tragedy that must be internalized and repressed in order for a person to fulfill social expectations. So, for example, feeling real grief but having to hide it in order to fill gendered expectations of masculinity, hiding emotions to appear less childlike, hiding core features of one's identity in order to obtain acceptance. Those are all traumas, but a very different kind of trauma. And I want to note that those can and often do appear simultaneously. In a lot of cases in the literature, a trauma equals a turning point. And I must stress that when I say that, I do mean in literature. Traumatic experiences are constructed as turning points in narratives, but that does not mean that traumatic experiences are always turning points in life. In children's literature, traumas and their subsequent repressions and internalizations are often growth experiences, signaling the beginning of a more mature phase of life. Children who undergo traumas in books or media come out knowing or understanding more than they did before. Now, it's also relevant to note that in psychology, trauma theory is all about repetition. That's why we write about, talk about, and think about traumatic things, even as we also repress them. And that theory originated with Sigmund Freud, who noticed that World War I veterans relived traumas in terrible nightmares, what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And he studied this phenomenon by watching children who would reenact scary or unpleasant events in their play. So one example is that scientists observed children after witnessing the crash into the World Trade Towers in 2001. They might have seen it on TV or seen it in person. People observed a lot of kids building block towers and crashing them down with pretend planes. They weren't trying to be creepy, they weren't trying to be insensitive. The theory is that this repetition takes a painful and traumatizing experience and makes it at least manageable, if not pleasurable, by restaging the trauma under more controlled circumstances that enables a sense of mastery or familiarity for the person who is repeating the trauma. Now, more modern scholars follow that theory when they talk about our obsession with disaster headlines, literature about traumatic events, even think about just the interest a lot of people have with really awful things like serial killers. If we repeat, work through, master traumatic events in spaces that we feel familiar and in control of, we try and desensitize ourselves to the things that frighten us. So that's where childhood comes into play. We must always remember that when we speak of children's literature, we're speaking about literature written by adults for what they imagine children to be. If we understand adults as trying to work through their traumas through repetition, we get a glimpse into the reasons that children's literature often deals with trauma. What an opportunity to gain mastery over the traumatic. Our social construction of childhood innocence sets children up as both perfect victims and perfect survivors, so child characters can work through adult traumas on our behalf. Victimhood requires adult guidance and protection, which is important to our constructed boundary between childhood and adulthood, right? We think it's really important for children to be able to rely on a trustworthy grown-up. And meanwhile, those same child characters can be constituted as survivors who in turn protect adults. We perceive them as innocent and able to offer spiritual advice in how to triumph over pain through simple, honest, essential values like love, trust, hope, and perseverance. And then when we subject child characters to literary traumas, we may be subconsciously working through both our own traumatic experiences as well as reifying our beliefs about the boundaries between childhood and adulthood. We might also be reassuring ourselves that children are capable of withstanding traumas. Victim children are protected from traumas by the adults in their lives, and savior children retain their core identities and rise above the trauma. The reason that trauma in children's narratives is almost always resolved is because of our second topic today. Hope and trauma really do go hand in hand in children's literature. Trauma without hope isn't a part of the children's literature genre because of our constructions of childhood, and hope really cannot exist without trauma. So when we talk about hope, we're really talking about belief that something good can come out of something bad, that things can, if not will, get better. Now, Dr. King wrote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. He's putting forth that there is a lot of work to be done in the world, but that he believes that outcomes are fundamentally hopeful. The belief that everything will be okay, or at least that it has the capacity to be okay, is hope. It's the opposite of cynicism. This is a really essential idea in children's literature, largely because of our cultural investment in childhood innocence. We desperately want children to be shielded from harsh realities for as long as possible. So even as we present trauma, perhaps for our own psychological reasons, we always maintain a sense of hope in children's literature so as not to tarnish that innocence. But Kiefer and Tyson write, cynicism and despair are not childlike emotions and should not figure prominently in a children's book. Even though children are quick to pick up a veneer of sophistication, of disillusionment with adults and authority, they still expect good things to happen in life. And although many children do live in desperate circumstances, few react to these with real despair. They may have endured pain, sorrow, or horror. They may be in what we would consider hopeless situations, but they are not without hope. Now, we might push back that this is a bit of a generalization, but that's a discussion for another moment. After all, that is a similar generalization to the one we might say adult authors make in writing children's literature. That belief in hope and innocence is a pervasive cultural investment. Kiefer and Tyson go on to say, this is not to suggest that all stories for children must have happy endings. Many today do not. It is only to say that when you close the door on hope, you have left the realm of childhood. And that's really the epitome of what we're working with here. In our particular model of childhood, hope and childishness go hand in hand, and that shows up in the literature we write for kids. The thing about hope, though, is that it doesn't really need to appear unless there is darkness to begin with. We might read, like, an alphabet book for kids and say, see, this isn't really about hope, and we would be right. Hope is a feature of narrative children's literature. That means literature with a story. And in a story, in a narrative, there has to be conflict. The greater the conflict, the greater the opportunity for a strong theme of hope. K.L. Going is the author of a book for kids called Pieces of Why that deals with the effects of gun violence, and she offers these thoughts. How and why does one attempt to translate the toughest realities of our world to children? The answer to how, for me, is to offer as much hope as hardship, and as much beauty as brutal honesty. What else can we offer our children in the face of violence, other than the same comforts we offer ourselves? The hope that in the end, goodness will outweigh injustice. The desire to change our world for the better, and the belief that change is possible. One of the most powerful functions of fiction is to allow us to imagine the futures we want and those that we don't want, and to empower our society to make decisions accordingly. To deny the existence of gun-related violence to kids who live with the aftermath does nothing but teach them that they can overcome this legacy and perhaps create a different future, offers hope that another path is possible. A final major theme in children's literature is home. Home shows up to some degree in almost every work of children's literature. When we talk about home, we're talking about more than just a place to sleep, eat, and take shelter. In a literary sense, we're also talking about the feelings of belonging and security that come along with those spaces. Where the Wild Things Are gives us a great example. When Max returns home, he's not just coming back to a familiar space. He's relieved to find that his mother has cared for him and brought up a meal even after she sent him to bed without supper. That sense of comfort, of having been taken care of, is perhaps even more important to our understanding that Max has come home than the fact that he has returned to his physical bedroom. In children's literature, home, security, and belonging are synonymous. Now, the role of home is what really matters in designating children's literature as distinct from young adult literature. Home figures really prominently in literature for children as well as literature for adolescents, but the job it does is very different. That connotation of home as a space of belonging, safety, and comfort is distinctive to literature for kids, and in this case, kids means up to about 12. In young adult literature, home takes on sort of the opposite function. Rather than a space to return to, home is a place to escape. It's a symbol of childhood that needs to be cast off in order for real maturity and identity formation to happen. A good reference point if you're trying to determine if a work of literature is a children's book or not is the role of home. We see the importance of home in many of the most significant works of children's literature in history. Dorothy's goal in The Wizard of Oz is to return home, to that sense of security and belonging. We see it again in the Harry Potter series, when Harry dubs Hogwarts his home after finding security and belonging there, as opposed to his cupboard under the stairs with the abusive Dursleys. Now, the actual narrative arc of home depends a little bit on the subgenre of literature. So we talked about domestic literature, where home is the center of the action. In adventurous literature, we see a pattern of home, away, home, where the protagonist starts out at home, leaves for an adventure, and then returns home again. Now, it's important to note that the definition of home can change in that process. So we might think about Harry Potter as an example if that's something familiar for you. Harry starts at an unsatisfactory home. He leaves and then finds a new definition of home. Now, granted, he does return to the original location, but that doesn't constitute the return to home as much as the discovery of a new home might. Regardless of the genre, however, we do see a close association of home with the domestic, with femininity, and with motherhood. Remember that in Coraline, home and mother were practically synonymous, and that was actually used to create an unsettling effect. Because home is meant to be familiar and comforting, its recreation becomes frightening, both because of its similarities and because of its differences. While home ought to be singular, in Coraline's case it was not, and that's where the horror began. So next we're going to think about how trauma, hope, and home have appeared in the books we've read so far. In Coraline, the central trauma is the loss of Coraline's parents. It's a deep-seated fear many humans have of abandonment, and it's hashed out very literally in Coraline through a creepy disappearance instead of through mundane death. Coraline works through emotions we might repress, like feeling unwanted or ignored, and the hope offered in the novel is that the relationship can be regained. The story ends on a hopeful note as Coraline finds her parents, seals the door to the unfamiliar, frightening other world, and engages her parents in family bonding activities. In that way, the safety and comfort of home, although temporarily lost, are reified. In One Crazy Summer, the trauma begins really before the novel. The girls have lost their mother, and that traumatic experience continues when they arrive in Oakland and realize that emotionally she is still lost to them. Now that trauma is reasserted again when Delphine, Vanetta, and Fern see Cecile arrested. Cecile is both physically, through her release, and emotionally, through her conversation with Delphine, returned to them at the same time, and Delphine finds hope in the idea that she might grow in her relationship with her mother, as well as in the notion that the similarities she shares with her mother are not all bad. Here, home is figured in an adventurous context. The girls depart from home in Brooklyn, fly to Oakland, which gradually becomes a second home as material objects like the stool, the radio, that symbolize emotional connections are introduced, and then they return to Brooklyn, a home that feels secure, though now perhaps in a stifling way. And finally, in George, we're dealing with the constant trauma of body and gender dysmorphia. The novel ends on the hopeful note that Melissa may be able to one day transition and live her life as a woman, and that seems to be the home that she desires. Here, the home is not so much the space where she eats, sleeps, and takes shelter, but the body that she inhabits. So now let's start thinking about the novel in verse that you read for this week, whether it was Inside Out and Back Again or Brown Girl Dreaming. Where is the trauma? How does that integrate issues of repression and repetition? Where is there hope? How does home figure as a space of importance? I chose to discuss these topics during Poetry Week, again, not because they are specially relevant to poetic language, but because both of these novels address all three areas in very clear and significant ways. You'll see them clearly articulated in the book you read, as well as in the novels for the rest of the semester.